There is no hierarchy of victims, but there is a hierarchy of causes. So those who had fought for the ideals of the proclamation would, be the ones that would be central to our commemorations and our celebrations. But, people who, for whatever reason, and some fought for the highest ideals, as Sean Lemass said about participants in World War I, some fought for purely economic reasons in the British Army in World War I, but they weren't fighting for an independent Ireland or a republic. They were fighting for an empire. I suppose 1916 and the commemoration of it is celebrating what it was we were trying to achieve 100 years ago. And I suppose as well as that, we were benchmarking ourselves against how far we have actually come over those 100 years, how far we have come to achieve the aims and objectives of the proclamation in terms of equal rights and equal opportunities, civil and religious liberties. And while we have come a long way in the 100 years, we have still a long way to go. So I think it gave us an opportunity to look back on the last 100 years, but also to look forward to the next 100 years and see what it is we need to do in order to make sure that we actually fulfill the aims of the 1916 proclamation. Well, I was commemorating 1916 25 years ago on the 75th anniversary, when it wasn't popular or politically correct to commemorate the 1916 commemorations. I was doing the Leaving Cert, and I thought it was appalling that the state basically ignored the 75th anniversary. So along with 7 friends of mine, we decided when we were in school that we would put a tricolour that my grandmother had made on the roof of the school. So at lunchtime, just before Easter week, we broke into the attic in the school and then broke onto the roof of the school. And we ended up putting the tricolour out from the roof. And the principal of the school, Garrett Power, arrived back to find this tricolour flying over his school. And he arrived up to the Leaving Cert class, and he looked straight at me and he said, "Daly, was that you?" To which I replied, "Yes." And he said, "Who was with you?" And of course I said, "There was no one with me." Because the deal I had done with the other participants and volunteers in that case was that if we were found out, which of course we were going to be found out, that I would take sole responsibility. So the principal was not convinced by my story that I was on my own, because it took serious acrobatics to get through the little hatch that would get you into the attic. So he made me replicate the exercise, and how I managed to do it, I don't know, but I did manage to get back through the gap. And then he made me take down the flag, and then he sent me home. I was suspended and expelled for the day. But anyway, the names of the people who were with me at the time was Conor Murphy and Timmy Clifford, David Connolly, the 2 Kidney brothers, Sean and Donald Kidney, were with me, and there was a Stephen Burns as well. But I kept that under wraps for 25 years until I was invited back to the school on the 100th anniversary, when they were having their proclamation day, which was part of the commemoration events which we were involved in organising. And I was the guest speaker, and I outlined the events of 25 years previously, and then for the first time I named the participants, and of course some of their children were actually in the school at the time and were rather amazed to hear of their father's participation in the commemoration 75 years previously. Now, I suppose that was the in terms of the celebrations, and I suppose being on the committee, 25 years later was a long journey. But my family's connection to the struggle for independence included my grandfather, who was in the IRA during the War of Independence and the Civil War. He was Charlie Daly. He was in the 2nd Battalion in the Kerry Brigade during the War of Independence and the Civil War. And my cousin was Commandant General Charlie Daly, who was executed during the Civil War and was one of the 77 official executions during the Civil War, and was the highest ranking of those. So I suppose our connection to the struggle for independence goes a long way back, but I suppose the commemorations thing is a fairly personal one. So, I mean, having been on the organising committee in Kenmare on the 75th anniversary, I thought it was amazing to be back there to give a speech about it, being a member of the Governance Committee. Yeah, I mean, I was on the Governance Committee for 5 years, and I asked to go on it as the Fianna Fáil party representative on it. And for a long time, it was, I suppose, undecided, and there seemed to be no clear strategy. And it was very frustrating being on the committee, because a lot of issues in relation to the General Post Office and what will be done there, in light of the fact that there was no real centre in the General Post Office to mark that this was the headquarters of the Rising, the issues of Kilmainham Jail and access to that, but in general how the country was going to celebrate it. And it was desperately frustrating. And there was a number of initiatives which I undertook with some people. Diarmuid Gavin and myself got involved in an idea that I put to him about gardens of remembrance. So the concept was that you would have communities and organisations putting in gardens which would have three elements in common: a flag pole for the tricolour, a replica of the proclamation on granite, exact typographical replica, which would cost €195, and 7 trees for the 7 signatories. And he designed 7 different gardens, and community organisations or tidy towns committees could replicate those in any format they wanted once they had those 3 elements in common. And over 200 of them were put in over the last 6 months. Tidy Towns committees were very enthusiastic about him, and that was a great project to be involved in, because it was something that everyone could get involved in. It even went as far as Massachusetts, where there was Gardens of Remembrance put in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I suppose one of the nicest moments was when on Capitol Hill they put in an Irish oak tree to commemorate the 100th anniversary. So I was working with 2 congressmen, Congressman Boyle and Congressman Mick Mulvaney, from one a Democrat, one a Republican, and they got the Speaker of the House of Representatives to give permission to put an Irish oak tree to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Rising on Capitol Hill. It had only happened 4 times in the history of Capitol Hill that a tree commemorating an event in another country was allowed to be put on the hill. So I thought that was quite an amazing moment. But we had been involved in the GPO, and again, the time was running out, so I was involved with the Smithsonian. So I met the Smithsonian in Washington and outlined that there was no plan at the time, and this is, I suppose, nearly 3 years ago, where time was running out. So the director of the Smithsonian wrote a letter to me outlining how much time would be needed to get the GPO ready for the 100th anniversary, because we knew this commemoration was coming with 100 years, and not being ready and not having the GPO ready in time would be wrong. So the Smithsonian wrote the letter, and somehow or other it ended up in the paper that the GPO wouldn't be ready for the 100th anniversary, and lo and behold, it was denied, and that it wouldn't be ready, and the money came, and it was ready, as it should be. But then there was other issues, and it was very concerning, especially in the first 2-3 years of the committee, from 2011 to 2013, 14, where there was a proposal put forward by the then Minister for Foreign Affairs, Eamon Gilmore, that the Queen would be invited over. A member of the royal family would be invited over for Easter Monday, and I felt that was entirely inappropriate, because it would distract from the central theme. It would mean that the families weren't central, and it would also mean that the proclamation and its message would be lost, and it would all be about a security issue around the Queen. And thankfully that idea was rolled back on by the government. And then the other proposal, which was mooted and was discussed by the government, which again we felt was wrong, was that the British Army would parade on Easter Monday in Dublin in the 1916 commemoration parade. I did point out to the official that if that was to happen, that there'd probably be a live reenactment of the Rising, and it was the worst idea I'd ever had. Because it's, what we were trying to do was celebrate what we were trying to achieve, and, the people who were trying to achieve it, they're the people who should be central to it. And I pointed out that we had people who had fought in the British Army during World War I, and, there is no hierarchy of victims, but there is a hierarchy of causes. So those who had fought for the ideals of the proclamation would, be the ones that would be central to our commemorations and our celebrations. But people who, for whatever reason, and some fought for the highest ideals, as Sean Lemass said about participants in World War One. Some fought for purely economic reasons in the British Army in World War One, but they weren't fighting for an independent Ireland or a republic. They were fighting for an empire. And the 1919 elections, or the elections which took place in November 1918, and the first Dáil in 1919, showed that it wasn't the freedom of small nations, because when Ireland went to the Treaty of Versailles negotiations and said, we've just voted for an independent republic by democratic means, and they were rejected. So, I think that was one of the key elements, is about that we were celebrating people who were trying to achieve, I suppose at the time, great ideals in terms of equal rights, equal opportunities, revolutionary ideas for the time, but there was the mixed messages for a long time in the committee, which eventually, and I'd have to give great praise to Minister Humphreys and John Cloncannon, when they came on board, there was a lot of refocusing, and the idea of reimagining and of commemoration and reflection was brought into it. So I think it worked out excellent. It was a great commemoration, a great celebration. The schools got involved, and that was one of the other projects I was involved with. A Church of Ireland reverend named Reverend Michael Kavanagh, who's an extraordinary man. Not only is he a Church of Ireland reverend from Manchester, but he lives in Kenmare. But we sat down 3 years ago and we talked about the flag and the importance of reclaiming the flag, and the symbolism of the flag, often lost. Not only the symbolism, but the colour, because people sometimes go green, white, yellow, green, white, gold, green, but it's green, white and orange, and it's orange for a reason, because it symbolises the Protestant members of the community on this island. So we established the Thomas Francis Meagher Foundation, which is named after the man who created the Irish flag, and he spoke about its significance. Meagher said that the white in the centre signifies a lasting truce between orange and green, and between its foes, that the hands of Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants will be clasped in generous and heroic brotherhood. And that message was entirely lost over generations. And the idea for having it back for 1916, because the first time Meagher flew it on the 7th of March 1848 in Waterford, it disappeared nearly for 70 years, and then only reappeared on the roof of the GPO. So having it back in I suppose, common use and public ownership was a key message. So the foundation brought in a number of honorary advisory board members, including Packy Bonner and Henry Shefflin, Mickey Ned, the captain of the Kerry team in 1975, Cora Staunton, the Gaelic football player, Niamh Briggs, the captain of the Irish ladies rugby team, Stephanie Roach, who scored that famous goal and the goal of the year for ladies soccer. And then you had President John F. Kennedy's grandnephew, Robert Kennedy's grandson, Congressman Joe Kennedy, is on the honorary board of the foundation, the French Minister for the Diaspora, the Canadian Ambassador to Ireland, Congressman Rooney, whose uncle had been the Ambassador to Ireland. And those, gave their support to the idea of giving the flags a tricolour, which had flown from 33 of the Mall in Waterford to all the schools. And that event in Croke Park was the second largest event of 2016 outside of the parade itself. And I think it was very important. And we also changed the protocol on the flag with the Taoiseach's department. The foundation worked with the Taoiseach's department, and now the flag can be flown at night, preferably when illuminated by spotlight. So, there were some of the changes, and it was very important to get the message out there that the flag belongs to everybody. It doesn't belong to one group or individual. It's a flag of the entire nation. Well, I suppose the parade in Dublin, the GPO, being there for the 100th anniversary, I suppose that was special. My father was there with me, and we had the event on Capitol Hill. So my brother and sister-in-law were over that, and friends of mine were over on Capitol Hill for that event, and all these members of Congress commemorating Ireland. And actually, one that's to come yet is I worked with the National Park Service in Washington, and there's the Washington Monument has 196 plaques inside it. And my sister and Grace Kyle, who works in my office, were on a tour of the Washington Monument, organised by a friend of ours who works in the Department of Interior, Nikki Bufa, and they pointed out that there was no plaque from Ireland within the Washington Monument, and we asked the tour guide, why is there no plaque from Ireland? Well, because Ireland wasn't allowed to put in a plaque or give money towards the completion of the monument, because Britain wouldn't allow any of its colonies to give money towards the building of the monument for the general who defeated them. Ironically enough, there's a family legend in our side of the family, on my mother's side. General Sullivan, who was one of the key generals in George Washington's army, is a long-lost relative of ours. So obviously, given the fact that this is George Washington's monument and we had a connection somewhere along the line, we decided that we had to rectify this historic wrong. So we wrote to the director of the National Park Service and asked that on the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, which also happened to be the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, that a replica of the 1916 proclamation will be put inside the Washington Monument. And we justified this on the basis that the 1916 proclamation, which is the equivalent of the Declaration of Independence in the United States, mentions only one other country, bar Ireland, by name, and that is America, where it says our exiled children in America, and that one of our presidents was born in America, being Eamon de Valera, but also that a man who had created our flag, which is also mentioned in the proclamation, where it says summoning her children to her flag, which was created by Thomas Francis Meagher, that he ended up as a general in the 69th Regiment of the US Army during the American Civil War, and as governor of Montana, that he embodied the connections of the 40 million Irish Americans who lived over in the US, and that they would put in a replica of the proclamation, and they have agreed to do so. There's only 16 countries have a plaque inside the Washington Monument, and they get thousands of requests every year, but they have never acceded to anyone bar this. Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, like, you know, I suppose when you look at the parade and the amount of people who were there, and the thousands of community events that were held during the year, 4,000 or 5,000, and they're the ones that were recorded, that were actually, you know, recorded by the government. There were many more outside of that. And then you look at the ones in relation to World War I, the affinity, I suppose, is with the ones to do with the 1916 period and the proclamation, and, you know, as I said, like, there's no hierarchy of victims, but the hierarchy of causes is what brings people to commemorate and celebrate the 1916 Rising. There is not a lot to celebrate about. You know, the Battle of the Somme was just mass murder. It was an appalling tragedy, and, you know, it achieved nothing other than, you know, transferring colonies from one empire to another, you know, and that's not something that's worth celebrating, really, but obviously remembering those who died, and I suppose pledging not to repeat those mistakes. But in 1916, I think it's the commemoration of the ideals. That's what it is about. It's not who we were struggling against, it's what we were struggling to try to achieve that people reflected on, and rightly so.